Okay, so you've got the two biggest economies on the planet, the US and China, and both are feeling this intense pressure to change things up as the whole world shifts away from globalization. But here's the really fascinating part. While they're both getting squeezed by the same outside force, the problems they're trying to fix at home, they're basically polar opposite.
And that's really the big question we're tackling in this explainer. Are the US and China just dealing with two sides of the exact same coin? They're both feeling the pressure, but are the cracks starting to show in completely different parts of their economic foundations?
To really get what's going on, we've got to zoom out a bit. The backdrop for all of this, for both countries, is this huge global shift, a trend that's making everybody fundamentally rethink how their economies are supposed to work. And that big trend? It's called deglobalization. You see, for decades, it was all about building these incredibly complex global supply chains and letting trade flow freely. But now, that whole pendulum is swinging back. The focus is shifting to self-reliance, to making things in your own country. And a shift that big creates a ton of stress, forcing nations to look in the mirror and fix what's broken.
Okay, and this is where things get really interesting and the two paths totally diverge. The source material we're digging into argues that the US and China are perfect mirror images of each other. America's main problem is on the supply side, its ability to actually make stuff. Meanwhile, China's main problem is on the demand side, getting its own people to buy stuff.
So let's kick things off with the United States. Its big challenge is all about trying to rebuild its industrial power, which, as it turns out, is a lot harder than it sounds. The easiest way to think about it is that the US has a factory problem. The goal seems simple enough: bring manufacturing back home. But how in the world do you actually rebuild the entire factory floor for a nation of this size? Well, both the strategy and the execution have hit some pretty serious walls.
Now, the thinking, especially during the Trump administration, seemed pretty simple on the surface. Step 1, slap tariffs on foreign goods to make them more expensive. Step 2, the hope was that this would then convince companies and their money to come back to the US to build factories. I mean, on paper, you can see the logic.
But, and this is a huge but, there was a massive contradiction baked right into the policy. Because at the exact same time the government was trying to lure factories back, it was also cracking down on immigration, cutting off the supply of low-skilled labor. So what happens when you do that? Well, the cost of the very workers you need to build and run those new factories skyrockets, pretty much killing the whole project before it even starts.
And look, the problems didn't stop with labor. The nature of American investment itself has changed. See, a lot of capital these days is all about the fast buck you can make from things like stock market speculation, not the slow, patient, long-term investment you need to build a factory from the ground up. They're on the fact that huge chunks of the necessary supply chains are just gone, plus major issues with energy and infrastructure, and yeah, you start to see why this is such a monster of a challenge.
All right, now let's hop over to the other side of the world. China's problem isn't making things. I mean, come on, it's the factory of the world. No, its problem is the complete opposite of America's.
So, if the US has a factory problem, China has a shopping mall problem. They have absolutely no issue filling the shelves with products. The real challenge is getting their own gigantic population to walk into that mall and actually buy enough stuff to keep the whole economic engine humming. They have to build up their own domestic consumer market. And you can see the warning signs of this weak demand popping up everywhere. Their domestic market is actually shrinking. This puts a huge squeeze on the profits of the very manufacturers that are the backbone of their economy. That, in turn, weakens private companies, which forces the state to step in and rely more on old-school, top-down government controls instead of just letting the market work. So why can't they just, get people to spend more? Well, according to the source we're examining, the root cause is this really deep structural conflict. It's a clash between the powerful, vested interests of the country's ruling elite and what the general public really needs: a better shot at fairness, more security, and real economic opportunity. Fixing that isn't just about tweaking economic policy, it's a massive political challenge. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, you see both of these giants are kind of stuck, but for completely different reasons. Each one is wrestling with its own fundamental contradiction that's holding it back. And this all leads to a really powerful quote from the source material that just nails the whole thing. It says, China's contradiction is between the vested interests of the elite and the needs of social development. America's contradiction is between the profit-seeking nature of capital and the needs of industrial restructuring.
Let's just break that down, side by side, so it's crystal clear. Over in the US, you have the drive for short-term profits fighting against the country's long-term need to rebuild its industries. And in China, you have the powerful interests of the elite clashing with what the rest of society actually needs to thrive. It's two giants fighting two very different internal battles.
So, what's the big deal? Why does all this matter so much? Well, the stakes are unbelievably high. We're not just talking about some academic debate. If these core contradictions don't get resolved, both nations could lose entire decades of progress.
For the United States, the analysis we're looking at suggests that it has already squandered a huge opportunity, potentially losing at least 20 years by not getting its act together and rebuilding its supply side.
But get this, for China, the stakes might be even higher. If it can't figure out this demand-side puzzle, it risks throwing away a staggering 40 years of progress. That's practically a whole generation's worth of advancement on the line.
And all of this brings us back to one massive question. We've laid out the mirror image problems, we've seen the core conflicts that are tearing at the heart of the world's two most powerful economies. So, with decades of prosperity literally hanging in the balance, can either of them actually find a way to break through and solve their own contradiction?